Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore transpersonal psychology and its evolution. With me is Professor Jorge Ferrer, who is Professor of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is the author of several books, including Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, a participatory vision of human spirituality. He's also a co-editor of an anthology called The Participatory Turn, Spirituality, Mysticism, and Religious Studies, and most recently, Participation and the Mystery, Transpersonal Essays in Psychology, Religion, and Education. Welcome, Jorge.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well. You are known as a pioneer of what's called the second wave of transpersonal psychology. Mm-hmm. So I guess it would be useful for our viewers to know a little bit more about the first wave. What preceded you? I guess many viewers will know that transpersonal psychology is the branch of psychology that studies spiritual experience.
Exactly, and consciousness and different states of consciousness. I would say that even before these two waves, there was what is called like the birth of the transpersonal psychology movement, and that was like in the late 60s, with the work with Abraham Maslow and Stanislav Grof,
Yes.
And it was like a psychology that was trying to move beyond humanistic psychology to encompass, as its object of study, also the farthest reaches of human nature, in the words of Abraham Maslow, not only a psychology of psychopathology of what goes wrong in the human being, but how can we grow beyond the average, and what happens to human beings when they grow beyond the average. That was humanistic psychology. Mm-hmm. But then at that point in the late 60s, there was like two movements that confluenced in California and in other places. One was like the countercultural movement and the psychedelic movement, and the other was like the coming into the West, and in America in particular, of Eastern gurus and Eastern spiritualities.
Yes.
So these psychologists were interested in these further reaches, and then they start kind of like experimenting with psychedelics, and they are also studying with these Indian gurus. And they start realizing, well, there is something interesting here, like some of these states that we access with psychedelics seems like very similar to what these Indian gurus are talking about, that reflect like higher stages of human development beyond the normal egoic functioning. So I would say that was kind of like the birth of the transpersonal movement.
And like all births, it was very much grounded in the life experience of the founders.
Exactly. Stanislav Grof was one of the founders, and he was coming from Prague, from Czechoslovakia, after doing tremendous amount of research with LSD in particular, one of the pioneers of psychedelic research that today is undergoing a huge revolution and renaissance. So that was kind of the first birth, and then from that first birth, like a first wave of transpersonalism was emerging.
I mean, the very idea that psychology should study spirituality was unheard of.
Exactly.
At that point, it was like, leave that to the religious nuts.
Exactly. Like today is like almost like common sense, and in many New Age circles, but also like in the culture at large, psychology and spirituality do come together. Mm-hmm. Even like in major universities like Columbia, they're doing like programs in spiritual psychology, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of becoming mainstream. But at that time, you are completely right. It was completely like something very new.
In fact, I can tell you this. I remember, and you may also remember, the Association for Transpersonal Psychology applied for an affiliate status with the American Psychological Association and it was denied.
That's correct. That's correct. And still, I would say that the American Psychological Association can look with some kind of degree of suspicion to transpersonal psychology. Yeah. You know, like the American Psychological Association is very wants to make the field very scientific, but very scientific in a very narrow sense. It's like following a model of science of like physics and biology. So anything that kind of like trying to expand like ways of knowing and different states of consciousness and study those in different ways. It's like something that they kind of tolerate, but they don't want to be very prominent in their divisions.
In fact, the person who led the opposition to transpersonal psychology was a brilliant psychologist, former friend of mine, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, Rollo May.
Yes.
An existential psychologist, a brilliant man who considers himself a mystic.
Yes.
And yet he said, as far as he's concerned, transpersonal psychology is people who are practicing religion, but trying to call it psychology.
Yes.
He said it's really just religion.
Yes, you see, but this connects with my criticism of that first wave of transpersonal psychology that you were referring to, because in a way, I think there was something of truth about Rollo May's perceptions, in the sense that, Maslow and Grof wanted to do a more scientific study of spirituality and consciousness, but then the first wave, especially in particular with the works of Ken Wilber and others, and even Stanislav Grof as well, as he kind of start unpacking the cosmological implications of his research, they start becoming like more like giving us like different kind of like stages of spiritual development and evolution, and all of them follow like this kind of unilinear sequence, leading to what they consider to be the greatest spiritual achievements. For example, non-duality or absolute consciousness, and that's a religious claim. That's a religious claim.
It is a religious claim if you look at the words that are used, but my sense is this, that the psychologists working in transpersonal psychology all understood that the mystics would say, well, I'm using words to describe my experience, but in truth, it's not capable of being expressed in words. It's ineffable.
Yes.
And that there's some core experience of human consciousness at a deep level, which is brilliant, overpowering, magnificent. People refer to it like cosmic consciousness or God consciousness. And, and they say, whatever words I use will never begin to describe it.
Yeah, I understand. As you know, like I'm also a student of comparative mysticism, and
we'll do another discussion just on that.
And that has been one of the areas, focus of my studies and one of my passions. And the more deeper I go into the different traditions, and the more I realize that there are many different states. Cosmic consciousness is just one of them, but there are many different states, and different traditions talk about a diversity of states of consciousness and a diversity of even ultimate endpoints. And what the problem with that first wave of transpersonal psychology that I receives the name of being neo-perennialist, like from the perennial philosophy, this idea that all traditions are speaking about the same ultimate truth or the same spiritual universe.
Call it the primordial tradition. That's the book title by Houston Smith.
Exactly.
I've interviewed him about it.
Exactly.
I never got to interview Aldous Huxley, who died while I was still in high school, but he wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, making the same point.
Exactly. So in a way, like the first major transpersonal theories, and I'm thinking here about Ken Wilber and Stanislav Grof, and even Michael Wasserman as well, they were perennialist. They are perennialists in different ways, in the sense that they do believe in this kind of universal spirituality. So diversity is only at the surface, in the religious forms. But if you go deep down, if you go into the mystical core, all spirituality is like, like different paths going to the same peak of the mountain or going to the same ocean. And this is something that today in religious scholars or students of comparative mysticism, they do not accept. It would be very, very not very well receive or very well consider those particular views.
Well, I think it's fair to say that academia today globally has been strongly influenced by postmodernism. And one of the main tenets of postmodernism, ironically, is that there is no such thing as a main tenet or an absolute truth anywhere.
Yes. Yes, and the thing with postmodern is that I think postmodernism has something valuable because it brings invite us to appreciate diversity and pluralism, and we live in a very diverse and plural way that has been too often marginalized, and many people have been marginalized and not saying because of lack of appreciation. And a lot of these kind of perennialist incursions into other traditions have been experienced by traditions themselves as very colonialist. Here we are again, Western male theories telling, looking at the diversity of religious traditions of the world and telling how they are arranged in this particular order, leading to this particular point, So as you can imagine, like practitioners from all those different traditions, they would have like a lot of things to say.
And usually, as you point out, and I've experienced this as well, in each tradition where they talk about this is our hierarchy of spiritual attainments, it's usually their own tradition that takes you all the way to the top.
Exactly. You're right. So we have a variety of hierarchies, a variety of developmental paths, and then at the top we have a variety of different ultimate endpoints or spiritual ultimates. And each tradition, of course, chooses the one that their own tradition doctrinally tells that is the one, So you have here the beautiful conflict of religious cosmologies, But coming back to transpersonal psychology, I would say that the second wave that in a way I played some role in kind of alumbrating and developing together with other important theories like Richard Tarnas and John Heron and other people. The second wave was in part a reaction to what we experience as some kind of religionist biases in the first wave of transpersonal psychology that connects with Rollo May's perception. There was something there, I think he went too far, but he was sensing something.
Yeah. He was sensing that the practitioners of transpersonal psychology seemed very wedded to particular spiritual paths that they were studying.
Exactly. And this has practical implications because, for example, during the 80s and the 90s, when the second wave was kind of prevalent, many transpersonal and humanistic psychotherapists start interiorizing those schemes in their practice. So then they would, for example, situate their clients according to those schemes. Oh, well, he's a shamanic practitioner, therefore is less evolved than this Buddhist practitioner, less evolved than this non-dual practitioner, or if he's a theistic Christian, well, he's situated here. And in kind of implicitly or in kind of more subtle or less subtle ways, they were trying to push their clients through their spiritual counseling and coaching in the directions of those schemes. What in a way boils down to religious indoctrination and not allowing aborting the organic spiritual unfolding and individuation of each human being.
So in your book, Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, you really take issue head on with that approach.
Yes.
Basically, you're saying we should give up the idea completely that there is such a thing as a absolute perspective from which every spiritual tradition can be judged.
Exactly. That there is one single absolute, that we can put over the rest, right? Yeah. Because we have all these ultimates, right? We have God, we have the Tao, we have emptiness in Buddhism, and we have actually 20,000 religious traditions in the world.
20,000
or more today.
Yeah, sure. Religions spread and evolved just like biological species.
Exactly. So in that context, to even think, that just one single tradition, has the truth and the others they don't, or is a lesser truth, is kind of problematic, and brings this other topic we'll discuss, I think, about spiritual narcissism.
Well, if we look at biology psychology as sort of a metaphor for the spreading of religions, we humans consider ourselves to be at the very top of the biological tree, so to speak. We're at the top of the food chain, and I think we consider ourselves to be superior to every other animal. And I'm guessing that just as you challenged the idea that there's a perspective from which we can say which spiritual approach is better than others, that the same thing might be true of biological species.
Yeah, I would say, my sense with that is like, I believe human beings were special in very particular ways, as well as other species are special in other particular ways. I think that there is like a tremendous amount of freedom and creativity in the human species, more than we can at least understand and fathom in the animal world, in terms of like creative decision making, intentionality. There are degrees of all of those in the animal world, but not to the extent. This is what I think makes us specialness, this degree of self-consciousness, But that doesn't make us superior in an absolute way to other species, biological species. That's like a disaster.
I mean, there's an enormous amount we can learn from earthworms.
Absolutely. The whole like disciplines of biomimic, is like, it's engineering and technological, geeks like learning about, solving their most challenging problems, like looking at nature, So there's so much we can learn, and they can if we really like listen to them, and with not only an open mind but also an open heart, because I think to learn from nature, it's not only just to open your mind, you need to open your heart. I believe.
So basically, your perspective is that rather than looking for the most superior spiritual tradition with the highest guru, with the most attainments, you are advocating an approach where every individual sees every other individual as someone we can learn from.
Yes.
And someone maybe we can teach them something too.
Yes, we're all teachers and students. I'm sure you have so many things to teach me. I'm sure every person that is watching this video right now has something important to teach me. And I'm sure there is something, even if it's something very small, I can teach to almost all of you. And I think that's important. But my approach also brings like critical perspectives. And I think that's also an important consideration. I'm a spiritual pragmatist in the sense that even though we cannot rank traditions according to how well reflect or represent this kind of particular supposed single spiritual ultimate, I think that some traditions are doing better than others in many ways,
Sure.
So, for example, I think like the Buddhist meditative tradition has so much to teach us about meditation, right? And I think we have so much to learn from indigenous traditions about harmonious relationship with nature. And I think there is so much to learn from the Christian traditions about courage, charity, and like work for others, and the theology of liberation and things like that. So I think all traditions have something to learn and to teach. And but not from a superioristic way, but from a place of like mutual collaboration.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you about that. I have often felt that the spiritual traditions of this planet we've come to a point in history where these traditions are the inheritance of every human being, because the planet has become globalized.
Yes, exactly. And then the other part that I think is important is of this kind of spiritual pragmatism, is that for me it's not so important if people are practicing Buddhism or shamanism or they are hugging trees or they are being conscious parents, For me, almost every human activity can be engaged as a spiritual practice. So for me, what is important is like how these people engage in this practice are becoming less self-centered, less narcissistic, less egoic, in a narrow sense. How that practice, how that path is making them a more integrated human being, versus a person with conflicts and tensions between their sexuality and spirituality, inner dissociations in their hearts, and how that path fosters something that is very important today, eco-social, political justice in the world, So I think that for me, and these are orientations, and of course each of them have their own challenges and they require a lot of qualifications and But I think that orientations that for me helps me to, when I see people practicing different spiritual paths, it helps me like, okay, this is working for this person, or not.
So there's a subtle point here that you're making, because you're saying, yes, it's a good idea to begin to evaluate spiritual paths, spiritual traditions according to such characteristics as how they help the practitioners become less narcissistic,
yes.
let go of ego, or how they help their practitioners engage in the processes of social activism and fighting injustice in the world. But you're also saying at the same time that those criteria are not absolute.
Yes. Well, they need to be tremendously contextualized. For example, when I talk about eco-socio-political justice, whose justice, right? As it was once as famously, by a great philosopher, whose justice, and this is one of the issues of our kind of global times, right? That there's a conflict of rights, there's a conflict of justice systems going on in our global village. So I think these are I think it's important to have certain kind of values that we bring into the table in the global dialogue, in that particular way, But even, for example, if you look at the narcissism, there's also the pitfall of self-delusion, right?
Yeah.
Many people, maybe some, they're practicing spirituality and they believe they are growing in tremendous spiritual heights and depths, and everybody around them, they feel, wow, this person is quite inflated, or it's he's becoming more narcissistic.
Called the stink of enlightenment.
The stink of enlightenment.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I think it's very important the sense of the community, the peers, the sense of peer-to-peer. We have spiritual friends and peers that are gonna call us on these things, you're practicing, you're drinking ayahuasca every month or San Pedro or whatever, and you think you're going somewhere, but actually every day we see you, every week, you look actually more self-centered. You just talk about your spiritual experiences. You seem to be less caring of your dog. What's going on? Yeah. And ultimately that's with the other test or orientation, that is a dissociation, right? Yeah. That's a very tricky one because so many religious traditions historically, we could say that they had many dissociative practices, practice that would repress sexuality, practice that would repress the body, or practice that would see with suspicion, the passions, of the human heart, So here I bring this a more normative dimension. I'm saying I think the traditions already reconstructed themselves in those particular directions and incorporating dimensions of human experience that in the past historically for many different reasons they were suspicious, but now they are doing it, so I'm really affirming that.
Well, if we look at human history, it's fair to say, I think, that many wars have been fought because religious conflicts.
Yes. That's, it's... I've studied a bit also interreligious violence in the world today present and some cases in the past, and you can always see more than these religious ideas. There's always a lot of economic factors, political factors, ethnic factors would be problematic to reduce the cause of an interreligious war or conflict to just one factor, but still it's easier to kill your neighbor when you think you have God on your side, right? When you think you have God on your side and he does not, or when you think your spiritual ultimate is the superior religion than the others, it's easier. So in a way, all these things that we are discussing in this kind of second wave of transpersonal psychology, more participatory, has relevance for today's interreligious global wars.
And as I recall, you were engaged with an organization whose very purpose was helping religions to operate more in harmony with each other and less conflict between them.
Yes, that was called Religions for Peace at the United Nations, and that was a beautiful encounter for me. Personally, because the Secretary General, when I asked him why did I got invited here, I'm a transpersonal psychologist, he told me he had read my first book and that it had shaped the way he approached some of his dialogues, and that's the best thing one can receive, right? That one of your babies, right? Yeah. Because a book is a baby that has a life of its own. Suddenly, someone takes it and influence something that is important. A book that was more theoretical, right?
Well, I think it's one of the most exciting things about your approach, because many people have suggested that transpersonal psychology is a lot of navel gazing and people who are, isolated from the world at large, and what good is going to come out of it anyway? A lot of people, engaging in fantasies that they are more spiritually evolved. But what you're saying is that this approach, the transpersonal theory, can make a meaningful difference in helping the world's religions to get along with each other.
Yes, absolutely. And also, of course, I would say that transpersonal psychology has made I think a very important contribution to psychotherapeutic and clinical practice, I think the distinction between the psychotic crisis and the spiritual emergencies, very important, Still have a number of people in psychiatric institutions being medicated that with a different approach they could be happy, fulfilling lives. So that's something that is very, very important, and of course, the inclusion of some spiritual and religious problems in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there was transpersonal psychology in that. So it has been doing things more practical in the last decades, and I think we're very, very happy over this.
Well, it's one of the kernels, I would say, of transpersonal psychology is that you don't dismiss spiritual experience as being the product of some kind of a return to an infantile state, the way Freud did, or as some sort of delusion, the way I think many behaviorists would treat it. You regard these experiences as authentic, at least authentic for the people who are having them.
Exactly. And also, to add to that, you believe in transformation. And this is one of the things that distinguishes, I would say, most transpersonal psychology from other psychologies, the belief in transformation, not just, healing the symptoms or just helping the person to cope with. No, there is a deep-seated belief that person can radically change, even someone who has been diagnosed with psychosis, well accompanied, could come the other way around if the process is well accompanied and pushed forward, versus being kind of slept anesthetized with medication, then this person can re-emerge in a higher state of integration, and these cases of this, so there is this trust, ultimately it's a trust in the human nature, in how human nature can really from within kind of regenerate itself. We hope Gaia will do as well.
To me, there's an irony here. Well, many, actually. But one of them is this. You are now known as one of the pioneers of the second wave of transpersonal theory and transpersonal psychology. Yet, as I listen to your approach, it strikes me as very reminiscent of William James, who died over 100 years ago, and who, long before transpersonal psychology as a discipline was founded, but I regard him as the first transpersonal psychologist.
I totally agree with you, Jeff, and I think that the parallels you're building are meaningful because William James, I also consider him one of the pioneers of the field, even if before the field was born, right? With his experiments with states of consciousness, with even nitrous oxidors, his interest in mysticism, from the perspective of psychology. I mean, he was the one,
But also, in particular, his focus on the plurality.
Exactly. And pragmatism.
Yes.
Exactly. Plurality and pragmatism. I learned quite a deal from him, from Isaiah Berlin, in today's world, many philosophers that have been interested in pragmatism, have been very important influences, and William James was one of those. So I think you're making like an important bridge there.
Let me ask you one other question. Now, we talked briefly about postmodernism.
Yes.
And how postmodernism would be consistent with your approach to spirituality and religions in general, that there is no absolute perspective from which we can judge spiritual traditions. But let me ask you, do you consider yourself a postmodernist?
Thanks for the question. Not at all. Not at all. I think I would say I consider myself a meta-modern author, in the sense that I integrate insights and ways of knowing from pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity. And there's like a contemporary current called meta-modernity.
Meta-modernity. I like that.
So meta-modern. But one of the things that distinguishes very strongly my approach from postmodernism is like both modernity and postmodernity, they completely bracket or deny any kind of ontological, any kind of reality to a spiritual reference, They're saying, well, people are having a lot of different experiences, but they happen in your brain, they're kind of symbolic process of the mind, but they do not exist out there, And in my approach, I'm kind of much more open to that kind of like the reality base of what we encounter, So that's something that postmodernists or even modern critical individuals would totally say, no, we don't want to go there.
Yeah, I know they do say that, although I don't think it's really well integrated into their philosophy. It's just sort of baggage
I agree.
I think they're carrying along with them. But let me put the question to you a little differently. Do you think there are any absolute truths?
Define absolute.
Well, good. Okay. Do you think 1 and 1 plus 1 equals 2? Is that an absolute truth?
Probably in context. In a context of
needs to be viewed in context.
Exactly.
See.
So it's like with all the geometrical truths. Depending on the kind of geometrical what you're playing with. In
other words, you're not a Platonist.
No. No. But for me, I don't have any problem, for example, with accepting that there are many universal things about the human condition. We all have eyes, unless you have a handicap, we all eat, we breathe, we reproduce, There's no problem. They're called homoversals, right? Universal truths about the human condition, and there's no problem with that. The thing is, once, as anthropologists has taught to us for decades, once you look at the meaning of all those things for different cultures, you understand? Everybody eats. But what eating means drastically different things across the cultures, right? The same with breathing. Breathing, everybody breathes, but what it means, right? And human beings were like a meaning-producing species, and where we live in a meaningful universe, that I think, in part, we co-create with a meaningfulness that I believe exists out there, but that's a different topic.
Well, yes, the question is, I suppose, ultimately, is there meaning in the universe independent of us?
Yes, that's one of the big questions. One of the big questions. My bet would be yes, that our capabilities for meaning production emerge from the cosmos, because we're part of the cosmos. That's what it means to participate in the cosmos. And wherever you want to believe that meaningfulness, or that there's like a spirit orchestrating the whole thing, or that somehow these meaning-producing creatures emerge randomly, I think that both are equally awesome miracles that create the same sense of awe and reverence to being alive in this cosmos.
Because I know, for example, Houston Smith, a philosopher of religion, I interviewed him many, many times before he died. A wonderful man, but he would have said that the closer we get to God, the more meaningful everything becomes.
I would agree, but I would qualify. I wouldn't use the term God again, because it's a term that would only be meaningful for a number of traditions, many billions of individuals that they are more into theistic traditions,
Because not every spiritual tradition believes in God.
No, not at all. And for many, for example, I'm also a San Pedrista, and I hang with indigenous people, and indigenous people it's not about God. The meaningful experience is about in connection, in interrelatedness with nature, between themselves, collectively, and it's a very different type of meaningfulness, you know, than that meaning comes from being close to God. I think it's different. For me, the meaning of life ultimately is something that in Spanish we say is el sentido de la vida. Sentido de la vida. Sentido also means sentir, to feel. So for me, the meaning of life is not something that you are going to get with our minds. Oh, the meaning of life is this or that, a statement. It's something that we can feel in our flesh. And, you know, you can feel it or not.
Well, that's, now we're getting to your emphasis on embodiment, embodied spirituality. And you mean that quite literally, I believe.
Yes. And that's kind of like, I think that's a very important development, because I think there has been so much suffering in the world, and continues to be a lot of unnecessary suffering due to what I perceive as a lack of embodiment of spirituality. For example, all the sexual abuses that all the tragic sexual abuses from Christian priests, from Hindu or Buddhist teachers, from shamans today, is pandemic. Okay, it's pandemic.
Yes, it is. I would agree.
So how to understand that? You know, we can understand it in many different ways. You know, there is people who could be, you know, very evolved in a developmental line, right, spiritually or psychic. You know, but many of these people, sexually, interpersonally, emotionally, they are in different places. They could be kids or pre-adolescent, or they could be also wounded themselves. They have been abused, and then they perpetuate sexual abuse, and that's very common, as you know. So basically, spiritualities that helps people to cultivate what I call a heart chakra spirituality. A chakra from your heart, from your heart chakra, and consciousness and up, but kind of forget or dismiss or sublimates or try to control the body and sexuality. I think that you start creating a dissociation there. And what I'm advocating is from a spirituality that really that really incorporates the wholeness of human experience, including sexuality, including the body, in a way that all those walls can be more gradually integrated.
Because many people have been raised to believe that the body is like the antithesis of spirituality.
Exactly.
Carnal interests are considered unspiritual.
Yes, we're considered demonic. In Christianity, and in many places, still considered sinful, right? Any kind of like desire, or even in other traditions, not theistic, like certain Buddhist schools, predominant Buddhist schools, actually, sexual desire always was seen with suspicious, you know. This is something that's going to take you, out of track into the path of enlightenment, you know. So this is why it's so important to recover all these dimensions. I think there was some evolutionary meaningfulness to that in the past, in the sense that there could be, it's an hypothesis, but we could hypothesize that there was a time in human evolution when the values of the heart and human consciousnness were kind of getting stronger, kind of like individuating themselves for a more instinctively driven human life, right? As we move from being more animals to human beings, whatever that distinction is, it makes sense, you know, that there was a necessity to suppress some of those very strong impulses, you know, to cultivate those states. But I don't think that in most cases here in the West, that's longer the case, you know. I think there's a time to you know, having cultivated the heart and consciousness to reclaim and redeem, you know, and invite them into the spiritual feast.
Now we're getting into some very interesting material. I mean, what does it mean to be fully human?
Yes. That's a huge question. I mean, that's one of the objects of transpersonal psychology, right? It's a psychology that claims to approach it's a whole person psychology. They say, well, other psychologists are looking mostly at the mind, you know, and the brain, and even these parts of cognitive functioning, you know, and also psychoanalysis, the emotions. But I think transpersonal psychology tries to be a whole person psychology that takes into consideration the fullness of the human being.
One of your critiques, as I understand it, of the first wave of transpersonal psychology is that it was rather, I think you used the phrase, cognitive-centered.
Yes, I think so. Also, too much emphasis on states of consciousness what are wonderful, and I'm very interested in them, with not so much emphasis in the integration of those experiences, in an embodied integration, in the body, in the different parts of oneself, in the community, in society. There was this fascination with good reasons, because remember, all these systems of consciousness were like suddenly like available for us, Western modern people that have been for many centuries, dominated by certain forms of Christianity that religiously that have not been really supportive of those explorations, right? On the contrary. So then therefore those years was like all this fascination and this excitement with good reasons, but then there was like this kind of cognizantrism, that was like this set of consciousness are the best, over others, and I take a more systemic ecological approach.
Well, I think it's not just the religious traditions. It seems to me that culture as a whole rewards people for being smart.
Absolutely.
Pretty much more than anything else. You can get some rewards for being musical or artistic, or if you dance or sing well, but by and large, for the great masses of people, the smarter you are, the more rewards you will get from the culture. So we begin to think of ourselves as almost disembodied intellects.
Yes. And there was some fascinating phenomenological research done on modern Western individuals, and then they found out that most people at any moment of the day, when there was like this cue that to pay attention to their experience. They're experiencing here. This is who I am. Yeah. They didn't have consciousness of their bodies at all. And I think you're right. Like this cognizantrism is like this overvaluing of one particular form of intelligence over others. This intellectual, logical, analytical over others is a disservice to ourselves. It also creates problems with the cross-cultural encounters with other people that have developed other intelligences, and then we consider them immediately to be much more primitive. And also has a huge impact in our children and our education, because this is what gets rewards. Education gets very cognicentric as well. The daycare, kindergarten. Kindergarten is a pretty holistic education in most countries. But as soon as you leave the kindergarten, everything gets to here.
And even in kindergarten, it seems to me, if I remember, we were taught basically, if you're feeling anything in your body, then you're probably sick. Basically, you shouldn't feel your body.
Exactly. Yeah, that pains me hearing that.
Well, I think it's very American. And in fact, in the 19th century, as I recall, there was a famous fellow, Graham was his name. He invented the graham cracker. And he went around advocating that people should not feel their bodies unless they're sick.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Unbelievable.
And yet it strikes me that the body is, I think of the body as a spiritual antenna.
Absolutely. Yes. And I even would go further. It's a spiritual antenna, but I think it's a spiritual manifestation in itself.
Yes.
If we understand spirituality as something that is also embodied, not something that happens in more subtle levels of reality or happens in your consciousness, but we understand that the perhaps part of the amazing thing about planet Earth is that it's a place perhaps unique in the cosmos, probably not, in which there is sentient life and consciousness and matter can come together, and embodied love can take place. Incarnation can take place. Then this planet becomes like something really like special in its own way, not in an ancient anthropocentric and kind of like a geocentric way, but especially in the sense of their special role in meaningful spiritual evolution, and I think the body is like, it's the tool. It's kind of the tool, and one of the things sometimes working with students and with people is like sometimes there is a point in the spiritual development when you do just meditation or consciousness that, and I've talked with many practitioners and they agree, it's like there's a point in which unless you don't make changes in the hardware, the new softwares cannot fully be permanent there. You know, people access these states and then they come back to everyday life. Their whole habits come back, the neurosis comes back, and so forth, you know, especially when they work with medicine sometimes.
But when you say changes in the hardware, what do you mean exactly?
Changes in the very physical, the structure of the physical and energetic body of the person, you know. And,
the physical and energetic body.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the kind of changes like, and of course many of those disciplines are informing and promoting those changes, you know. But sometimes, for example, disciplines that are just meditation. You know, sitting, my body's sitting, my body's immobile. And I just count my breath and just have meditation. Those disciplines by themselves, I don't think that sometimes can really affect deep changes in the hardware of the body. And that doesn't mean that they cannot go to amazing places and liberations of consciousness in consciousness. But for most of the people, and even awake people I've seen in those traditions, I don't see like a fully embodied, individuated spiritual.
And you've spent many years meditating.
Yes. Yeah, about 15 years, yes. Long retreats every day. Yes, it was like a big commitment. But, there were many things happening there for me that, one was that I realized like, I don't think I want to become like my teachers. And, any kind of path, it's, you know, you see the exemplars, you know, and, there was a lack of, in that particular traditional, no need to mention it, there was a lack of vitality, there was a lack of, sensuality, there was very, almost an aloof coldness, in that particular tradition. So, and I was also becoming aware myself of, through contact with other more somatic approaches in the West, and that there was so much, you know, spiritually speaking, that one can learn as we go, you delve deeply into the body, and even in sexuality, and in many other places, you know, other resources. And so for me, more holistic, integral spiritual development needs to engage the two poles, the pole of consciousness and the pole of energy.
And I guess another important feature of your approach in your book, Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, is the idea that we don't just have to study the existing spiritual traditions, all 20,000 of them on this planet. It's perfectly appropriate for people to carve new paths.
Yes. That's a very important idea. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Basically, I'm kind of like trying to affirm and empower what I call a spiritual individuation. You know, like the capability of each human being to you know, in psychology, you know, we talk about psychological individuation, but as you move to spirituality, suddenly, you know, the different schools, they go towards more heterogeneity. Homogeneity, right?
Yes. Homogeneity,
yeah. It gets like the same dress and the dress of their head, they practice the same meditation, like, so the diversity is kind of constrained. And, there might have been some good historical reasons for that in some periods, but I think today, especially for the Westerns, and especially after, you know, after the individual, there is problems with our individualistic ethos, but there are some good things as well. And I think that one is that we can really become who we are, you know, like as we embrace our spiritual individuation. And for that, yes, you can learn from different traditions, and also your own body and your own being can bring forth novel spiritual practices.
Because I remember in my youth, I was told, I don't remember from whom, but many times that, there are many spiritual paths that are going to work for you, but you need to choose one and stick with it.
Yes.
And you're suggesting something a little different, that people can be more creative than that.
Yes. I think that's a typical argument against, for example, New Age eclecticism, right? Oh, these people who are like hummingbirds from flower in flower, they are never really going to go to any depth. I would say depends. Depends on the approach and depends of the depth of the person. There are people who are solid, very evolved in many ways, and they can tremendously grow from contact with different traditions. And I think today, who is not in contact with different traditions in our global village today spiritually, you know? And that doesn't mean that there is no value in going very deep in one tradition. And actually, I think going deep in one tradition, at least for a certain amount of years, it can create a foundation, a solidity from which to later, branch out and incorporate other things from other places. It's not the same when someone, reads several books on shamanism and Buddhism and then start offering workshops on shamanism and Buddhism than when our friend, my ex-teacher John Halifax, creates her integration of Buddhism and shamanism after many, many years of study of the two traditions. It's not the same.
That's right. I understand that. I suppose you could say it's like travel. It's good to travel to many countries, but it's also good to become deeply engaged with at least one culture.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's a good analogy.
Well, Jorge Ferrer, what a pleasure to have this discussion with you. And I'm pleased to let our viewers know that you're here with me in Albuquerque. We'll be doing many more interviews while you're here.
Thank you very much. The pleasure has been mine.
Thank you for being with me, and thank you for being with us.